Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. My name is Daniel Schaffer. I have the privilege of being the chair of the advisory board here at the law school here at Bristol University. I'm also a partner in the law firm Slaughter and May. I studied law here, and indeed 2 of my degrees are from Bristol University. Before I hand over to the award-winning radio journalist Asmar Mir, I just want to say briefly 2 things. The first is this, that tonight the objective is to entertain you, to educate you, but above all, to provide practical help for you. And employability is one aspect of that. Employers are interested, very interested, in your ability to think, and a degree from Bristol University will impress and be proof of that. But potential employers like Slaughter and May are also very, very interested in the extent to which you engage with thinking about thinking in order to judge your potential. So it's a privilege for Slaughter and May to be here this evening in me representing Slaughter and May and to be able to participate and support this event. The second thing I want to say is this, that I have 3 boys who are your age. I get, and everybody else on this panel gets, the challenges that you face. And tonight is about the methodology to address those challenges. So could I invite you all to sit back, think, and enjoy. With that, I will pass over to Asmar Mir. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to this I think you can see, really special event in a beautiful venue. The last time I was here, I was graduating. I threw that degree pretty much under the bus, but hey, I made it, and you will too. We are joined tonight by what can only be described as a fantastic panel of guests, several of whom have a special connection to this university to help us explore thinking about thinking. Over the next 90 minutes or so, we're going to hear about the highs and lows of, I suppose, the attempts of trying to achieve brilliant things, whether it is rowing across the Pacific Ocean or presenting a winning case in court, or just writing a brilliant essay. Even if you only write 1 brilliant essay in your 3 or 4 years here, that will be more than I managed. Now, we're going to unpick the mental, We're going to unpick the mental processes involved in both preparing for and achieving your goals, how to prepare for and deal with those inevitable bumps in the road, and don't worry, there can be plenty of them, and we'll be sharing some tips for success, some actual practical tips, be it improving your academic results, boosting your employment prospects, and looking after yourselves, because that's something that I think we all forget to do when we're studying. And very importantly, if you have questions for the panel, you have to be active in this. We want you to send them our way while we're talking, and we will come to you at the end, time allowing. So we want you to tweet. The address is Bristol Uni Law. That's the tag. And the hashtag is thinking about thinking. So it's Bristol Uni Law, that's us on Twitter, and thinking about thinking is the hashtag. We would, of course, want you to have your phones on silent while we're talking, but you can use your phones, please, while we are talking to submit your questions. They'll be looked at, edited, moderated, etc. And then at the end, we will pick the best ones and invite you to stand up, if you so wish, and ask your question to whoever you would like to on the panel. So there you go, Bristol Uni Law, thinking about thinking. Let's meet the panel. Please give a warm welcome, of course, to Steve, Georgie, Elsa, Michael, and Elizabeth. But instead of me talking, I'm going to get each of them to introduce themselves and tell us one interesting thing about themselves. Steve, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, well, good evening, everybody. My name's Steve Fleming. I'm a cognitive neuroscientist and psychologist based at UCL in London, at the Wellcome Centre for human neuroimaging. So I did my PhD at UCL in neuroscience, and then I went abroad to New York to do postdoctoral research, and now I'm back where I started running a lab there. And I guess one interesting fact is that I'm a keen sailor and do quite a lot of racing, although I've not done as much ocean-going stuff as we're going to hear about a bit later on in the program.
It's not a competition.
Yeah.
Georgie.
Hi, I'm Georgie Twigg. I was part of the GB women's hockey team that won gold out in Rio. And 4 years prior to that, I was part of the bronze medal team in London 2012 while studying law here at Bristol. And I deferred my training contract after 2012 to prepare for Rio, and I've now just started my training contract at Bird & Bird.
Elsa.
Cool. Hi, I'm Elsa Hammond. I am an ocean rower, a travel writer, and I'm actually still in my final year of a PhD here at Bristol. And one interesting thing, I once unicycled across England.
Michael, beat that.
I can't. I'm Michael Ford. I'm a professor here at the University of Bristol and QC in private practice at Old Square Chambers. The interesting thing about me, if it's interesting, is my main passion in life is cycling. So I had 4 years off university, before university, where I cycled full-time, and here I am in my 50s, still worrying that I've not done 300 kilometers this week.
Elizabeth.
And I'm Elizabeth Rimmer. I'm the Chief Executive at Law Care. We are a charity that promote and support good mental health and well-being throughout the legal community in the UK and Ireland. I started my working life as a solicitor practicing clinical negligence litigation for claimants. An interesting fact about me is really relevant to today. I spent some time this morning learning about how dogs think, as I'm a new puppy owner, and we've had a few problems. So I had someone in, and it was actually really interesting learning a little bit about animal cognition.
Thank you all. I mean, hopefully that gives you an idea of the people behind the names. Some of you do have connections to Bristol. Georgie, you mentioned. What's your best memory of studying at Bristol that you can say in public?
Gosh, best memory, that's a hard question. I just had a fantastic time here at Bristol, and I actually haven't been back either since last time I was here was my graduation. But for me, you know, I have such fond memories because Bristol University supported me. It was in my second year. I can remember exactly where I was in my house in Redland, and I got a phone call from the GB Women's head coach asking me to go and trial with the senior team that were training towards 2012. And I was then offered a full-time place, and I still had 1 year left of my law degree to complete. And, you know, it was a really difficult decision because, if I'm honest, I didn't really think that I was going to get selected for 2012, and I wanted to complete my degree. And the university allowed me to split my final year over 2 years. They recorded all my lectures and seminars for me, so I would be based at my training base Monday to Thursday, doing all my studies remotely. I then get back on the M4 and go into my tutorials on a Friday. And yeah, they allowed me to balance that.
Elsa, you said you mentioned you're studying here for your PhD in Romantic and Victorian poetry. Where do you hang out in Bristol?
Well, I've lived in a number of different places in Bristol. I've lived in Eastville, Easton, and Clifton. Where do I hang out? I spent quite a lot of time in Friska Cafe down just over there. So I think that was probably one of the major places I've spent time. And I guess down in Stokes Croft quite a bit as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Canteen.
We're going to move on now and talk about, well, we're going to get a definition really about metacognition, because I have to admit that when I first heard the word, I'm not going to pretend that I knew what metacognition was. But when I realized what it was, I thought, well, actually, that's just a very long, clever word for something that I think we all do, or all aspire to do anyway. But Steve is the expert here. Can you just explain then, in idiot terms, just for me, what is metacognition?
So metacognition literally means cognition about cognition, or thinking about thinking, and it's really a collection of brain processes that allows us to monitor how well we are performing in a variety of situations. So we use metacognition a lot of the time without really thinking that we're using metacognition. And recent research is showing that it's critical in our ability to learn and perform in a variety of settings. So it's not just enough to be clever, we also need to know how much we know about a particular topic in order to succeed.
So can you give me an example of when I or anyone in this room might use metacognition on a daily basis, perhaps to do something quite mundane?
So a classic example would be, imagine you're watching television and an actor appears on the screen and you think to yourself, I know that person, but I just can't quite place it at the moment. And this is what psychologists call a tip of the tongue state. And it's quite common, so each of us have tip of the tongue states about once a week. They get more frequent as we get older. We don't really know why that is. But it's a classic example of metacognition because it shows that there's one part of your brain, there's a system in your brain that knows that you know something, even though at that moment you can't quite recall it. Right. And that's a case where metacognition is really helpful because it prompts us to then keep searching for that information and eventually retrieving it. Mm.
I mean, you say that our levels of metacognition deteriorate as we get older and we don't know why, but what about when we're born? Are we all born with the same levels of kind of built-in metacognition or not?
It's interesting that there is now increasing amounts of research on seeing how early metacognition emerges, and there are now experiments that are detecting the first signs of metacognition, the ability to monitor how performance is unfolding in babies. But what we're finding, what we focus on in my lab is how there is variation in metacognition across the adult population. So we all know that people vary in, say, their sporting abilities or their artistic ability. But what's less well known is that people also vary in their metacognitive ability. So how good you are at monitoring your performance. And so what we find in our experiments in the lab is that you might actually be performing a task very well, such as a memory task. But some people will be better than others at knowing how well they're doing on that task. Right. And we're interested in understanding, using brain imaging technology, why that is. What areas of the brain, what circuits in the brain are governing the metacognition aspect of that performance.
The TV example that you gave was great because I think pretty much everyone has had that, that happen to them. But in terms of all the experiments that have been carried out over the years involving metacognition, what is the best one that you've come across that best illustrates what we're talking about? I
think that without wanting to say our experiments are the best, maybe I'll tell you about one of our experiments. So we've done an experiment looking at how people are able to monitor their performance on a very simple task. So we strip out all the extraneous variables. We just kind of zero in on the metacognitive aspect. And so the task involves you sitting in front of a computer screen trying to decide whether one image is slightly brighter than the other. So a really simple task. But what we can then do is get people to perform at a similar level as everyone else and then investigate on a moment-to-moment basis. We ask them, how confident are you in getting the answer right? And so then we can study how your confidence corresponds to your performance. So people with good metacognition should have high confidence when they're right and less confidence when they're wrong.
I see.
And what we find is that people who do have good metacognition have differences in the structure and function of an area of the brain called the prefrontal cortex. And so this is particularly enlarged in humans compared to non-human animals, for instance.
But that sounds like it's something that you can't change.
So
give us hope.
There is hope, absolutely. So in a line of research we're doing now that's we haven't published yet, but it's looking really good. We've managed to develop ways of training metacognition, and then also we've brought people into the lab to image their brains before and after the training, and we actually see plasticity in these prefrontal regions. So we see changes in the function of these regions, and that correlates with their improvement in metacognition. Okay. So there is absolutely hope.
Oh, good. Right. Although not if you're getting old. You mentioned sport, which beautifully segues into the next couple of people I'd like to talk to, which of course is Georgie Twigg and Elsa Hammond, both who've taken their sporting and physical pursuits to the extreme and have achieved fantastic results. I'm really interested in talking to you too about psychological barriers and what you came up against and how you managed to overcome them. We're going to start with you, Georgie. You and your teammates at Rio last year made, I think it's fair to say, you made hockey look effortless. Now, I played hockey for about a term at school, and it's not effortless or easy. I know that you've probably been asked this many times, but I wonder in the context of what we're talking about today, about knowing how good you are or thinking about how you can improve your performance, how did that moment, how did it feel to you then, and how does it feel to you now? The moment of winning.
Oh, I still get goosebumps watching it. And it still feels very, very surreal. I think Rio itself, we were in our very own bubble, and I think in the theme of this evening and the thinking, I think the thinking behind the team was that we were going to stay the 16 girls as a group, as a unit, and not get affected by anything else that was going on. So, as boring as it sounds, we had the same routine every day in the village. You know, we took each game as it came. We didn't focus too far ahead. We were all off social media. We weren't checking any newspapers, any channels, because we couldn't afford for a small negative comment to affect us. And I guess going into that final, again, it may sound very easy to say, but it was another game. We were prepared. We'd played Holland many times before, and we couldn't think about it in a bigger scale than it was. I know it was an Olympic final, but we couldn't, because if we made it into too big a thing, then actually we wouldn't be able to do the processes that we trained so hard to do.
I mean, winning a medal, you're talking about the Olympics, you're talking about, millions, billions of people watching you, but if you rewind a bit to when this particular sport first came into your life, and then you first said, actually, yeah, I'm going to go for it, how much did you believe in yourself at that point that you were good enough?
I think, as I mentioned earlier, when I got that phone call, I really didn't believe that I could get selected for Olympic Games. And I think I found the first 6 months, the first year, really tough in that, I was only 19 at the time. I felt quite intimidated by a lot of these senior players, these idols that I'd, looked up to for so long. And I found myself thinking that I just wasn't good enough. And even though I kept getting selected for tournaments, my minutes were quite low, and you could probably see that I was nervous when I went on the pitch. And I think, it took me some time to build that confidence and that sort of self-belief in myself that I could go out there. And I think as soon as that sort of creep of confidence started to build within me, I think then, my performances started to get better, and actually started to believe that, I could go and get there.
Does it sound, Steve, like she was, I mean, it's easy for me to say that she was overthinking this?
Well, I think what the notion of self-belief being causal, if you like, in changing performance, I think that's something that psychologists have found to be the case in many areas of performance. So we call that self-efficacy. So the idea that actually changing your confidence, becoming more confident, doesn't just change your beliefs, but it also can then have downstream effects on how you actually perform. So that sounds exactly as you would predict, right, based on those findings.
Elsa, what about you? Because clearly what you were doing was so much more solitary. So the issue of self-belief is a literal one, isn't it? You're on your own and you have to believe in yourself. Rode solo across the Pacific Ocean, successful travel writer, unicycled across England, as you said. What were your levels of self-belief at the beginning?
I think for me, it was, I thought about ocean rowing for the first time back in 2006. I heard about it as something that people did. I'd never heard about it before. And I remember just thinking, I want to do that one day. And then just leaving it and kind of coming back to it every now and again and thinking about it and being like, well, I can't really do it now. I haven't really got any credentials to sort of use at all. And I remember how I sort of came to sign up to that race, because it was a race that I was involved in, that first one. I was sort of doing my usual every now and again, sort of Googling about ocean rowing and finding out about it. I guess it would have been 2013. And I came across this Pacific Ocean rowing race, which was the first ever one in the Pacific. They'd had races in the Atlantic before. And I just thought, wow, that'd be amazing to get involved in that first one there and do something a bit different. And I remember emailing the link to my boyfriend at the time and just saying, like, this would be so cool, I wish I could do it. And he emailed back and said, you should go for it. And I kind of thought, I was like, oh, maybe I should. So for some reason, that was like the kick I needed. So I actually signed up that afternoon and paid my fees and got back that evening. And I was like, I'm doing it. Next year, I'm going to do it. And so that just like, I guess that was the first thing. And then the next big thing for me was sort of telling people that I was going to do it. And that was almost bigger than admitting to myself that I wanted to do it, because it was opening up that possibility of being told that you're going to fail, of being told that you're really stupid, and all of these sorts of things. So I kind of ended up doing it in a big go, like put it on Facebook and like blogged and sort of emailed out to everyone all in one go. And yeah, there were sort of different reactions. I remember telling one friend, actually it was when I was over in CHH in Clifton Hill House, and sort of in the bar, and telling him that I was about going to do this thing, and he just looked at me and he's like, "You're going to die."
Yeah, we've all got friends like that.
Yeah.
This idea, Steve, of finally committing to something and opening yourself up, as Elsa was saying, to failure, is that, I mean, how important is that? And does everyone have that ability, or do some people just say, no, I don't want to fail. I don't want to open myself up to the possibility of failing.
I think what's interesting is that just the very act of the way we know that how confidence is formed in the brain. It's early days on this research, but one thing that seems really critical is just the act of acting, if you like. So when you act, you generate these internal feedback signals. And so I think if you don't act, and this is one area of research we're pursuing quite a lot at the moment, is the idea that if you don't act, then you don't get that internal signal that kind of tells you, okay, I'm confident now. I can do it. And so we think that that's actually playing a role. The idea that acting is playing a role in forming the confidence is an interesting idea that there's more and more evidence for.
So if you don't try something that terrifies you, it won't start the process of the confidence appearing.
Exactly. I mean, there's a limit to that advice, because you don't want to be overconfident too much and just go for something crazy that is guaranteed to fail, perhaps. But I think there's a middle ground there where based on what we know of the biology of how confidence is formed, then acting is important.
Georgie, you talked about the self-belief that you said came slowly after maybe 6 months or so. But you know, we all have disappointments, setbacks, and especially in a I suppose in an academic and a sporting context, and it can seem so large. What was your experience of that, and how did you deal with the setbacks and the disappointments?
I think our biggest disappointment was so we'd obviously had the success in 2012, and then we were new Olympic cycle, really exciting, we were doing well, and then in 2014 we had a disastrous World Cup. We came 11th out of 12, and it was honestly horrendous. And I guess going into the tournament, there'd been a few niggles in the team, a few underlying issues, and we lost the first couple of games and sort of self-combusted as a team, so to speak. And I guess as a team, we didn't deal with it well at the time in the tournament, because we came 11th, we didn't turn it around. And from an individual point of view within the tournament itself, I was trying to think about this, and I guess I remember talking to myself and saying, right, next game, just do the simple things well. Control what you can control. So if you can deliver that bare minimum, then that's all you can ask for right now when the team is really is not going well. So I guess from an individual point of view, that's sort of what I did. But then actually, the main thing was when we got back from the tournament as a team, we debriefed it to the max. So we sat down as a squad with the coaches and talked. And it was fairly emotional at times, because we really needed to dig down into what had gone wrong, what were the underlying issues, and this is high performance sport, and if we wanted to be on that medal podium in Rio, we only had 2 years to really turn things around, and we worked a lot with our psychologist about the team culture and the team belief amongst the squad. And actually now, thinking back, I really do believe that was the sort of the key to our success in Rio, because of how much we debriefed that loss, and the things that we knew we couldn't get to that point again, and then things we knew we had to do. I think it sort of changed the mindset of the team completely, and really drove us forward in the build-up to Rio.
I mean, I know you can't apply a blanket rule, but do you think that if you hadn't come 11th out of 12th, if you'd come 5th out of 12th or something, you wouldn't have had that re-examination? You might not have been on that screen.
100%. And I think it applies to all things, not just even sport, because actually if everything goes great in your life all the time, there isn't that time to sort of self-analyze, be critical about making some changes, and just reassess to improve and to get better. And I think all of that learning process that we went through, because we did hit rock bottom, I think that played a huge success for us in Rio.
Steve, is it possible to examine what went wrong too much and then it just all falls apart?
Well, I think there's, I think Georgie did a great job there of explaining the debriefing process, and how that re-examination can have a positive impact. But then, I mean, there are cases, for instance, rumination too much on negative outcomes is a characteristic of, for instance, depression and anxiety. So there is clearly a case where you don't want to be ruminating too much if you cannot change things. But the key is to reflect on things you can change, and I think that's exactly what you're saying, that reflection process will enable you to make changes, I guess.
Yeah, definitely.
That's interesting. So it's the tip there really is to self-examine, but to only look at the stuff that is within your control.
That's right.
Elsa, I think it is fair to say that things often went against you too. And it's going to be interesting to see how you coped. First of all, let's just have a look, to get us in the mindset of this, a look at this clip of your video diary.
I've lost two already, both broke and disappeared along the way before I could grab them. So now I haven't got any left at all. That. So my earpiece, the sat phone, has stopped working. I just tried it and it works.
goodness me. We were with you. We really were with you. 5 days stuck in a cabin, broken oars, broken sat phone. But you didn't give up. Why not?
Well, let me just adjust that. So I didn't get to where I wanted to get to at the end. I didn't give up for a long time, but I had to make a decision about just under 2 months in to not finish, which was a very difficult decision to make, and is I suppose, a different thing.
Yeah.
And I might come on to that later. Well, I guess
But those,
why didn't I give up for a long
yeah,
time?
that kind of perfect storm of everything
Yeah.
that was going wrong, you persevered after that.
Yeah.
So why?
Well, I guess for me, because I didn't feel like I was someone who gives up, I suppose. I guess it was something I'd wanted to do for a really long time. I'd been through sort of tough situations before in terms of preparing for it, even just sort of living in difficult conditions, sort of out in the jungle or kind of camping, things like that, sailing. I'd read a lot about people kind of doing similar expeditions and the way that they dealt with issues, and I'd spoken to a lot of people as well who'd done similar sorts of things, and to a sports psychologist as well.
So how did you deal with it?
How did I deal with? Well, I mean, in terms of practically, I did what I could in terms of mending things,
Mentally.
got advice. Mentally, I guess a mixture of things. I was just recently actually re-watching a clip of me sort of talking about what had happened when the oars broke. So I had these sort of 2 oars that broke and then another one later on. And I am kind of in it, sort of, there's a bit where at the beginning where I'm slightly despairing of everything. And then I kind of pause for a moment. I'm like, oh, but actually, apart from that, it has been a good day. There have been these positives. It's, you know, I'm still going forward. I can still mend it. It's still okay. So I guess just kind of having to remind myself to sort of think about the things that were going okay as well, and thinking that I can deal with this. I've sort of read about how I can deal with this. I can get advice. You know, I can do practical things, or I can, I guess, get advice about how other people have sort of dealt with things, and I guess dig down to kind of having dealt with things before on a smaller scale,
Right.
but kind of build up.
Steve, what about this idea that I'm not the kind of person who gives up?
I mean, I think it comes into this idea of resilience. And what's interesting, I think it also comes back to what we were talking about before, about being able to control things. And there's a whole interesting line of research of what happens when negative things happen that people can't control, and that's when stress occurs and people become prone to crippling anxiety and depression. But I think what you're saying is that negative things happen, but you've realised you could control them, you could do things about them. And I think that's where resilience can then kick in, because you can, if you recognise you can solve the problem, then those negative outcomes are less. I guess you can become resilient in the face of them.
Did you feel in control of the situation?
Uncomfortable with
In control of it?
I felt very out of control of the situation quite a lot of the time. Just being
there's
pushed
another
around
oar.
by the waves and by kind of, but I guess what I was in control of was how I was thinking about it, or kind of how I was responding to it, kind of inside myself, not to sound too cheesy.
No, it doesn't. Hey, listen, there's nothing wrong with cheese. I mean, let's talk with Georgie and Elsa just quickly about the studying as well. I know that you, Elsa, are currently completing your PhD here at Bristol. How does that stress compare?
I think they're quite similar, actually. I mean, it's like particularly like with the PhD, particularly, it's this sort of really long thing where you can only do little bits at a time, and you're just building on it and building on it. And sometimes it feels like you go for a really long time and nothing's moved forward. And there's also the sense that nobody can do it for you, and you can get advice and you can get kind of help and things, but in the end, it's you that has to sort of actually just keep going and do it and sort of work on that. It's although it is quite nice sometimes when I am feeling stressed about the PhD, I do think, well, at least the ground's not moving. I can eat without spilling my food.
Georgie, you've mentioned this already about how you had this perfect storm of preparing for your final law exams while also training for London 2012, and you talked about how helpful the university were. No matter how helpful they were, that sounds like a crazy amount of pressure. So what did you do? Did you just start kind of putting everything in boxes and compartments and saying, right, I'm doing this today, I'm doing that tomorrow? How did you do them both?
Yeah, I guess I get asked that quite a lot, and I think, as bizarre as it sounds, I actually found that doing both of them helped each other, because there were two things that were so intense that actually one was an escape from one another. Yeah. So particularly in the build-up to selection for 2012, you know, this looming selection, you know, you're nervous about it. Actually, getting away from that and going to my studies or, you know, to do some coursework or something, actually that sort of helped. And I think likewise when you're doing revision, getting out and doing some exercise definitely helped give me that sort of balance. And I think in terms of how I kind of, yes, there were times definitely when I felt a bit overwhelmed, particularly in that period of time when selection was looming and it was quite hard to focus on the revision. But I think generally, I always found, I mean, I'm a big planner, so I plan out my days and everything is all very structured, because it had to be, you know, training 2 hours in the morning, 2 hours in the afternoon, right, where can I get my revision in? And actually it meant that it was a succinct chunk of time that I was doing my revision rather than having 7 hours ahead of me and doing a bit, but not, it's not really confined revision that's sort of to the point.
I think that's where I went wrong. Michael Ford, I mean, you're busy, obviously, as a QC preparing complex legal cases, but you also spent time on the Team GB Road Squad. Was that, obviously this was something that you enjoyed doing, but was one an escape from the other?
No, I did cycling full time. I took 4 years off before university, and it was all I did. Basically, I cycled a lot, then went to bed in the afternoon, then ate a lot, and then went to sleep. So it was an incredibly simple life. And in a way, I still miss it a lot, because it was extremely uncomplicated. And when I started at university, that's really when my cycling fell apart, because the hours of training you had to do was so much, and the rest you required was so great, and the infrastructure around you was so extensive, basically your parents doing all your washing and everything, and of course the temptations here were too great, so my cycling went by the wayside. But I've never ever lost the sort of lessons I learned from it about getting up early, putting in the hours, and making the training count. That's the other thing which I'm sure you would have from sport as well. There's no point in going out riding your bike. You're always training for a purpose. You're making sure the hours you put in generate returns.
But do you have, again, I'm sure you love your job, you love what you do, but do you have an escape from it? Is there something that you do that doesn't involve digesting lots and lots of information?
Cycling.
You still do the cycling?
Yeah, I still cycle all the time. And I think before a big case, I will always have a bike ride. I just think, you know, before I've got a difficult case, I'll always be on the turbo trainer the night before, because I want everything to calm down. I want all of that stress to be out. I would always do a bike. It's just like when if you've got a big cycle race, you always ride the day before. And I've never forgotten that. And of course, it helps you sleep. You sleep better. You don't wake up in a total, well, you still wake up in a total tiz. But you're in less of a tiz, because at least your body is calmed down.
We're going to come on to you and to Elizabeth in just a second, but Steve, just picking up on the idea of, I suppose, stress. You touched on this already, but is there the right type of stress and the wrong type of stress, and how does stress affect our brains and our performance?
There's certainly a thing such as too much stress. And so one emerging area of research is on the effects of stress on brain function. And one interesting thing there is that we know that too much stress can impair the function of the prefrontal cortex, which is those regions involved in our ability to reflect on how we're doing. And so, in a way, it's somewhat ironic that biology has endowed us with this this suboptimal association between stress and then a decreasing prefrontal function, so you're not able to recognize when you've got a problem, probably at exactly the moment when you do need to recognize that you've got a problem. So I think there's certainly such thing as too much stress. But these things often go, in terms of optimization of brain function, they often go in what we call an inverted U. So there's probably a sweet spot in the middle. You don't want too much, but you also don't want too little.
Okay. We're going to move on then and talk to Michael Ford and to Elizabeth Rimmer, who've been waiting patiently. Michael, I know that there's a lot of people, a lot of students in the audience who are very keen to hear about what they can copy from how you approach your cases. Obviously, you have to prepare to deliver a complex case, requires taking huge amounts of information, creating really sharp and persuasive reasoning. Simply put, what have you found over the years is the best, most successful approach to doing that?
Well, the first thing is I echo very much what Steve said. You've got to keep the stress under control. You can't look at the material and think, I can't cope with all this, because then you're into a tailspin. So, and I've developed strategies. They may work for me, but I'm still keen to learn off others. I still talk to other advocates and ask how they prepare. But I suppose first thing is really clarifying what you're preparing for. What is the goal of this case? What are you trying to achieve? Because that immediately gives you a focus to all of your reading. So you're not just reading stuff out of interest or because it's there, because you've got all these bundles and all these authorities. You're thinking, what do I want to get out of this authority? What do I want to establish factually? So it means when you're reading documents, you're putting them into you're digesting them. I'll put them into chronologies. I'll summarize them in my own words. So I'm always processing them somehow. Same with cases. Some students today were saying to me, we've got lots of cases to read. They're difficult, but when I'm reading a case, I'm thinking, where's the proposition of law? What's the principle this stands for? Where does this fit into the hierarchy? How do we get round it if it's against us? So I like to think I'm always reading it with a background purpose in mind. And equally, always testing the arguments, reformulating them again out loud, because my rough rule of thumb is if you can't state the argument out loud, if your mum asks you, what's this case about, and you can't tell her, you don't know it, you don't understand it. If you can't explain it, and it's the same in court in a sense, the judge right at the start, and let's face it, a lot of them are extraordinarily rude, so what's your argument? Tell us your argument, and you can't start fumbling in your documents and saying, well, if you read paragraph 17A, B, the one with the smudge above it, you'll see it there. You've got to be able to say, this is the argument in 3 simple terms. I suppose everything being read. Oh, and one other thing, always thinking about counter-arguments. What's the problem with this argument? In the fees case, of course, you construct this fantastic edifice, but if you're exploring it with other people, occasionally they will say things to you that you realize, blimey, that's a good point. What am I going to say if I get asked that in court? And if you haven't worked out a response to it there, if you can't tell them there in the calmness of an environment where you've got time to think, you're not going to work it out in court. So you're always testing the material.
I don't mean to sound rude in any way, but all of that sounds blindingly obvious. Are there barristers who go into court not knowing what they're trying to prove?
There are barristers who go into court who haven't really thought about the counter-arguments. Right. I'm not going to be rude about my profession.
Can you name them?
Interestingly enough, they tend to be the ones who exude confidence, usually, because they think, oh, this case is very simple, and then early on a judge will say, well, what about this? And I'll go, oh, I haven't thought of that. So it's again this kind of balance. You don't want the overconfidence to convince you that this case is easy, because often cases are difficult. I mean, they are often fantastically difficult. Anyone who's been at the bar will have been absolutely slapped down in some cases. I was confidently telling people before one Court of Appeal case, I didn't think it was possible we could lose. And then we lost. You get things like these happen, and so you learn that you have to be ready to address the points that are going to come at you, and as you get higher up, the judges get cleverer, the opponents get better. So you need to be prepared, not just for this simple argument that you think works, you need to know those cases that you haven't relied on, but they're in the bundle somewhere. What if your opponent just suddenly starts turning to these cases and referring the judge to them in oral submissions? What are you going to do then if you've not read them? So you need to have an enormous amount of preparation, which doesn't find its way into your written arguments or into your oral submissions, but is about dealing with points that are going to be raised against you.
What about taking in huge amounts of information in lectures, etc.? What would you say is the best approach to that?
Well, when I was older, I did a biology degree. I'm not quite sure why. I thought I wanted to do sciences.
Just for a bit of fun.
Yes. And the one thing I noticed there, and I still notice it, I better be careful I'm not too rude about the students, so I really get into trouble, is people not processing information in lectures. So I was always taking notes in my lectures. And then afterwards, because I'm fantastically anal, which I again learnt at the bar, you've got to have the most anal systems for preparing. I would go back, I would write them in my own words, I would read round them. If there were points I was unclear of, I would work them out. And I think I'd learned that from the bar. I was always thinking that I'm processing it, that I wasn't just sitting there and listening to it passively.
I'm just really interested. The students in the audience, how many of you process the information from lectures in the way that Michael has just said? You sit there, you take notes, and then you go home and you write them out again so that you understand them at the time. Don't be shy. Please, I want to know, who does that? And well done to you if you do. You're all going to be fantastic QCs one day. So either not that many or they're a bit embarrassed.
Yeah, well, it's both, isn't it?
I think also one thing to say about that is that recently, and when I give lectures at UCL, lots of people are now bringing their laptops into lectures. Yeah. And there's recent research showing that that's probably to the detriment of learning, because you can type a lot faster than you can write. And so you then become in a bit more of a passive mode, and you just write everything down that's being said. And there's been studies done to show that actually writing longhand, both at the time and afterwards, helps you assimilate the information, because it forces you to compress it. It forces you to put it in your own words. So be a bit careful with the laptops. That would be my word of advice.
Interestingly enough, I still write cross-examination out by hand, because it focuses your brain more. And I still write out some bits of the argument by hand. Because you're, for some reason, I've never quite worked out why, in my experience anyway, your brain is more engaged when you're writing, and it has to be shorter. You can't write reams and reams, you can't cut and paste stuff. You have to have it simple. So I entirely echo that, yeah.
Elizabeth, when you did your degree and when you did your law conversion course, how were you taking in your information?
Well, I did my first degree and my law studies in the late 80s and 90s, before there was an internet or anyone had laptops. So I was very much sitting there in lectures taking notes. And I did used to go back and write out my notes. So the conversion course I found quite straightforward, but when I did my Law Society finals, which was the old exam, in those days, I don't know if it's still the case, you had to pass all of the exams in one go. So if you failed one, you had to reset the lot. So I was part of a group of friends at law school where we went through past papers when it came to revising, and each person had to choose a topic from an exam paper and present a skeleton to the rest of the group. And that actually really helped me. And it was only when I was reading up about metacognition that I realized that that was a technique, which I never thought about at the time, but that actually really worked for me, because I was always quite a last-minuter and somebody who would be panicking the night before. So actually being in that group really helped me, because I felt I needed to bring my piece to the group. If I didn't, I'd be letting my friends down. So that's how I sort of got through that. But it was a different era then, and maybe those skills are very helpful for my generation, because that's the way we were taught. Although I know now there are a lot more interesting techniques about learning, but we very much had that old-fashioned didactic style where you took notes. And if you missed the lecture, you had to get those notes from someone else and photocopy them in the library. And no one could email you anything. It didn't exist like that. So.
Yeah,
We all had
say stuff,
photocopier cards. I'm sure you remember those, photocopying reams of stuff. And you had to read cases in the library.
Yes, I remember these painful days. I remember them.
Whereas now I would imagine most people are reading these things online. And there's actually quite a skill in going into a library and looking up cases and finding them and working out how to read them in a way that assimilates the information that you need to get from it.
Now you are someone who, as you've said, you practiced law for, I think it was 2 years? But then you changed direction, and I suppose I'm interested to know, well, 2 things. Why did you leave the law and break the law's heart? And also, what was it like to start again and learn a new profession from scratch, I suppose?
Well, I did a zoology degree, so I then did the conversion course. And I was very interested in clinical negligence work. And I trained at a firm called Lee Day & Co., which is a high-profile legal aid practice, mainly for public law and human rights. But they also had a very large clinical negligence practice. So I felt beside myself that I was at Lee Day. I had trained with Sarah Lee. I had been taken on by her. But I actually found in practice that I didn't find the work quite met my expectations. And I think because I found it difficult to reconcile clients were coming in, actually the system that we operated wasn't really delivering what they wanted from us. What people wanted was an answer. Why was my husband killed by that doctor? Or why was my son catastrophically injured? They wanted a doctor to tell them why that had happened. They wanted their day in court. And actually what we were there to do at a baseline was financially compensate people for loss. And I found that personally difficult to sort of reconcile. So I think looking back, if I'd had a bit more support, I might have thought through that more. And I actually sat there thinking, I don't think I can do this for 30 years. I found it difficult. So that's why I decided to leave. And I wasn't quite sure if it was for me, so I did a master's in medical law and ethics. While I was doing that, my best friend's mum was the chairman of this charity that I got a job for, working as an administrator because I had a mortgage by then. And I, through a series of events, landed up staying there, and I moved into the voluntary sector. So I didn't really have to learn anything. I just learned, I guess, a different way of working. But it was sort of that path not taken. I didn't really have a plan. It just happened. And I found myself on a new path, and I really enjoyed it, so I thought, well, I'll stay here and see what happens. And here I am.
Now you, well, I suppose really you look after the legal profession and the parts of the legal profession that access your organization, Law Care. You look after their mental well-being, I suppose. You are where they go if they are feeling stressed, anxious, etc. What can you do for them, and what kind of people access your services?
So our key service is a telephone helpline. So we provide a space. Our line is open 365 days a year. Everyone who answers the phone in Law Care has worked in the law. They're a mixture of our staff and volunteers that we've trained. So everyone understands what legal practice is like. We've all been through it. So we provide that safe space to talk about something. It's very difficult for lawyers, particularly, to admit that they're having difficulties. Lawyers solve other people's problems. They don't have problems of their own. There's a lot of stigma around admitting that you might have made a mistake, or you're not coping, or you're feeling overwhelmed, and actually helping people to talk through that and feel reassured that actually we've heard from our panel this evening, everybody has those moments where they feel overwhelmed and feel they can't do things. And actually that doesn't mean you're a failure or you're not as good as somebody else. It just means you're having that moment, you're a human being, and helping people understand that you can move forward from that it's not game over. We signpost to other organizations that can help. We have a peer support program, so if somebody finds themselves, for example, in disciplinary proceedings before their professional regulator, which is an extremely difficult thing to manage, we will match them with someone who's had a similar experience. So it's a bit of peer support. So we have a helpline, we have a website. More people visit our website every year than every month than call us in a year. So we have lots of information about the common issues and concerns that affect the legal community.
We're kind of, because you very much look at the practical side of what people can do, but from what you've heard tonight on the panel about how people respond to stress and how everyone has various levels of self-belief, what's been the most surprising or interesting thing that you've heard today about how people react to these kind of situations?
I think what really resonated from what I hear, have experienced in law care, is I think that sense of being able to reflect when you were talking about your 2014 or 2012 difficult time with the team when you went down to almost bottom, is that there was a period where everybody looked at what's gone on. Is I think taking that step back and trying to understand the situation that you're in. When Steve was talking about, that curve, that we want to stay up here. We need a bit of stress. But the minute we start to tip down, what happens is people start chucking out of their lives all the things that help us stay well. We stop exercising. We think, I'll stay in the library another 3 hours. So then you don't get home in time to make yourself a healthy meal. You order in a Domino's. You don't go to football practice. You don't go to choir. You don't go to your book club. You don't go to the pub with your friends because you think, I need to spend a bit more time getting on with this. I'm feeling overwhelmed. Actually, you'd be much better off leaving at 6, getting home, making yourself something, go out with your friends, because those are the sorts of things that help us stay in the zone and help us manage. And it's not rocket science, none of what we're really talking about. It's actually, and as you said, blindingly obvious. We know this stuff, we just don't do it. Or we think we'll be better if we do another 5 hours of work. But we won't be, actually.
As someone who now tries to help people with these problems, did you suffer from that kind of those problems of stress and overwork and feeling overwhelmed when you were studying, or were you a bit more pragmatic about it even back then?
Well, I think by nature I'm quite laid back, so I don't get overwrought, I guess, sometimes by things. Certainly when I qualified, my partner that I worked for, Sarah, used to go off wolfing, as she called it, because she was part of Lord Wolf's team that was looking at the review of civil procedure. So she waltzed off and left me as a newly qualified lawyer with her caseload, which were highly complex clinical negligence cases. She was one of the leading practitioners in the country, and I found that very scary. I was waking up at 3 o'clock in the morning thinking, if I don't get this right, and she was in and out of the office. So what I actually did is I went and spoke to another partner and said, I need some supervision. I need someone to sit down with me on a regular basis. So I put my hand up and asked for some help, really. And I think that's a really important thing is not feeling frightened or embarrassed about actually going forward and talking to someone about something that's bothering you, and look for that help, because it's certainly out there.
We're coming towards the end of the evening, so remember, if you do want to ask a question, please tweet using the hashtag #ThinkingAboutThinking. I just want to talk just very quickly about emotions. We've talked a bit about dealing with stress. Elsa and Georgie, you have talked about how you were able to calm yourself and to focus on the kind of the task in hand. But how did you keep your emotions in check? Can you remember what did you do? Was it just a kind of case of trying to focus on something ahead of you? How did you kind of stop emotions from just making a mess of everything?
I guess in the final itself, probably not a personal story, but when Holly Webb stepped up to take that final penalty, she said that she imagined that she was back at our training base. And that sounds so easy to say, and I remember being like, really? And I think when we had practiced them endlessly, so that was one thing, but we'd also not just practice them physically, we'd practice them mentally as well. So we'd worked with our psychologist on trying to create a process that we could replicate in any stressful situation. We were never going to be able to replicate the pressure of an Olympic final. But actually, you know, we practiced walking from the halfway line to the ball, where the ball was on the 25. She made us walk and think about what we were going to be thinking about. And yeah, it was creating that process. And actually, Holly, when she stepped up to take that penalty, she didn't think about being an Olympic final. She thought about, right, I know what I can do. I've practiced it endlessly, and I'm going to stick with what I know I can do. And I guess that's an example of how, you know, not getting overwhelmed by emotions in a rather stressful and pressurized situation.
Elsa, what about you? How did you keep your emotions in check?
Well, I guess something that sounds really simple. I think for me sometimes sort of focusing on breathing at times. I remember that once kind of quite late on in the row, there was a great white shark that started circling the boat.
Great white shark.
and I did have this thing where I've got friends who are really, I guess, like sort of into their sort of like kind of marine animals and stuff. And I felt really guilty, but I went and hid in my cabin instead of instantly looking. But I had this thing of just being like, I just have to sort of calm and just like deep sort of slow breathing, and then just being like, I can't panic about it. Partly because I was aware that I didn't want to sort of attract by those sort of feelings of fear. But partly just being like, there's nothing I can do. I'm sort of here. I just like sort of breathing and just taking that moment to kind of to sort of breathe and wait. And then after a while I sort of went out and I just kind of like slowly rode away. But similarly in sort of storms and things like that, it was just that kind of focusing on the breath a little bit.
Michael, presumably you have to distill all the emotion out of what you're doing when you're presenting your case, or am I wrong?
Well, I think routines help you with that. But I mean, there's still an aspect to controlling of it. I mean, anyone who's been at the bar will tell you there's some judges, they know are going to be very hostile to them. They know they're going to be very hostile to their arguments. We've all done that thing of checking the court listing the night before and thinking, please, please, dear God, and let it not be X. I'm not going to give any names away. And then you go, oh no, it's him again, you know. And you think, and so I just found kind of basic, almost cognitive behavioral therapy type strategies where you'll think, first of all, well, what is the worst thing that's going to happen in front of this judge? And then how am I going to deal with it? So you think of, well, he's probably not going to like the argument, but that's not my fault. I'm going to present the argument politely. If he tries to bully me into conceding a point, I'm not going to concede it. And then we'll think about appeals later. But also trying to take the focus off myself in a sense, thinking, well, this isn't really me. This is just, you've got a judge. He's not going to like your argument. You're just going to have to deal with it. And you deal with it in the way you can, politely but firmly. And then hope you survive to fight another day. So I always found that basic, well, how am I going to deal with these difficult points? Useful strategy.
Okay. Well, just before we come to your questions, we're going to go along the panel and just see if they can, from what they've heard and what they've said, whether they can give you just their best tip in terms of maintaining strong mental well-being and achieving as much as you possibly can. Steve, you're the expert, you start.
Well, I mean, it's interesting that we've said that a lot of these points of advice are blindingly obvious when you hear them said on a panel like this, but I think what's important to recognize is that often we do fall foul of these, what I call metacognitive illusions. We think what's going to be good for us is actually not what's going to be good for us, and that's why we end up staying late in the library when we should go home and take the stress out. So I think the one piece of advice to package it into a soundbite would be work smarter. So we don't need to take in all this information. We don't need to keep plowing away. Instead, we need to think about what we need to get the job done. So work smarter, not necessarily harder, although hard work is also important.
Georgie, what would you say?
I think going back to one of my stories, I think learn and reflect on, you know, moments when things might not be going so well, but then also take confidence and self-belief when things are going well. I think that you can, you know, really make a change individually.
Brilliant. Elsa?
I think probably sort of just breaking big tasks down into small tasks and sort of just like little steps. So I had times when I was sort of rowing all day and kind of against the current and just being like, everything I'm doing is so small compared to how far I've got to go. And I had sort of, I suppose, different strategies to keep me going on different days, but sort of sometimes I would just be like, okay, I'll just row for like half an hour and then I'll take a moment and then half an hour, or sometimes I'd listen to like a couple of chapters of an audiobook and then take a break, or I'd be like, I'm allowed a sweet every hour, or something to kind of keep me going. And similarly, like with PhD, that's what I'm happy. Sometimes you just have to kind of, I guess, just sort of focus on that tiny bit, or just be like, I can just do footnotes at the moment.
So focus on the small bits.
Focus on the small bits and break it down, and don't get overwhelmed by the massive thing.
Yeah. Michael?
Prepare thoroughly, always engage with the material, always look at it from different perspectives so you're thinking about it rather than just reading it passively. Have a timetable so you know what you've got to do by certain dates and stick to them, don't adjust them. And most important of all, always go out for a bike ride the day before.
How long for?
Just an hour and a half.
Okay, just an hour and a half, everyone.
And then get a good night's sleep.
Okay.
Go to bed early.
Elizabeth, finally you.
I think share how you're feeling. I think that many times nobody really says how they're truly feeling about something if they are feeling overwhelmed. It is actually to talk to someone, be it a friend, a tutor, someone in your family, someone external, and actually feel reassured and feel better that you're not the only person that feels that way.
Okay. Right, we're going to go to your questions now. If you are happy to stand up and ask your question when I say your name, please do. And if you get a bit shy, then I'll just ask it on your behalf. But it would be nice to see the face and the voice behind the question. And thank you for making us trend in Twitter on Twitter in Bristol. The hashtag Thinking About Thinking. The first one then, this is a question to you, Elsa, and it comes from Kerry Huang. Kerry, are you around anywhere? Make yourself known over there. The microphone is coming to you. It looks like a box. Don't be afraid. I don't know what you do with it. Speak into it, I think.
Hello?
It works. Okay, what would you like to ask, Elsa?
Okay, I've never seen a microphone like this before. Anyway, so I was how did you deal with your loneliness and not knowing making it during the journey, like in middle of nowhere, especially?
Yeah, okay, so the question was, how did you deal with loneliness and not knowing that you might make it during the journey? How did you deal with the loneliness?
I guess for me, one of the main personal reason for me going out there was actually to see what it was like to be completely alone in the middle of nowhere. So it was, I kind of had to remind myself that that's what I'd gone out to kind of see what it was like.
Did you like it? Did you like the scent all the time, or not?
No, though it was terrifying quite a lot of the time. It was amazing, and I guess it was again sort of taking the moments that were really amazing, like the stars at night out in the middle of the Pacific are just like nothing I've ever seen before, or kind of moments of sort of meeting like marine, like kind of sea turtles and dolphins and things like that. I sing to myself a lot, so I do that anyway.
Now we're getting
that was quite helpful.
What do you sing, out of interest? What kind of stuff?
Like everything.
I'm not going to, you're really scared. I'm not going to ask you. I'm just,
I wasn't even thinking that.
I mean, what, like Justin Bieber? What? Little Mix?
Musicals.
Musicals,
Mainly.
all right, okay. There you go, now you know. If you're feeling lonely, sing musicals.
Yes.
Okay, next question is Harry Davis. Harry, where are you? Harry's there. Oh my goodness, you're getting thrown a ball.
Yeah, well.
I sent a couple, anyone in particular? I sent a couple of questions, is there one in particular that you want?
You've got picture and word association?
Oh yeah. Is picture or word association an effective way of improving metacognition?
Okay, so can picture or word association be a useful technique for improving metacognition, Steve?
So I guess, could you just explain what you mean by picture?
So I guess, like I said, I don't really know the science, but personally, my own purposes, I will sometimes use a particular image or another word that is very familiar to me, whether it be a brand or perhaps a product or something that I can then associate with the name of something like an actor, like the example you gave, or something involved in my work. Is that something that helps you bridge that gap between something you remember but can't quite remember?
So I think it actually comes back to something Michael was saying before, that one of the key things about memory and improving our ability to assimilate information is to recognize that that memory is not just a passive record of information. So it's not like a camera or a video recorder. The brain is always trying to actively construct what we know. And so any technique that helps you actively assimilate information is going to be better than just passively, say, reading it. So if you have, for instance, if you have a strategy such as trying to link things up with other cues to put that into your knowledge, then that's likely to be better than just sitting there passively reading the information. But one thing to say about metacognition is that it does often fall foul of these illusions. So sometimes we can think we know something that we don't. So actually the experience of kind of having a tip of the tongue experience, that's good metacognition. That's when we know something that we do actually know and we just need to keep searching for it. But at other times, it can create illusions and we can think we know something that we don't. So the trick is to try and find ways of avoiding those illusions.
Okay, next question. I think this will probably be for you, Michael. It's a question from Amanda Ramsey. Amanda, where are you? There, just, he's behind you.
I'm a PhD candidate here, and my study is cross-disciplinary, including law, but I think the question could apply to any law student. So it's, what advice or number one tip would you give a PhD candidate or a law student in preparing a case, so in my case, my thesis, and in terms of defending my case, how I order my evidence?
You mean when you're going to defend it orally, as it were?
Both.
Yeah.
While I'm preparing to write it and then present it orally, yeah.
Well, I'm not necessarily an expert on PhDs because I haven't done one, so maybe other members can say that. But I still think structure is important, similar to a good skeleton argument. You need a clear argument that runs through it. You need to have worked out at the outset what you're asking, what you're going to look at to try and assess the question, and what sort of evidence you're going to address in giving the answer. So I think structure, clarity. I think language matters fantastically. Every sentence you write should be clear, should be simple, and should be defensible, so you know exactly what propositions it stands for, and if you're asked about it, you can explain it because you understand what you're saying through it. In terms of the oral stage, I think many of the things that I go through before preparing for a court hearing are probably useful. That is, you test out your presentation with others. You articulate, you get others to ask you the sort of questions you may be asked. You give summaries to them as to what your thesis is about, so that you are in a position to explain very clearly what your thesis is about, and you're also prepared for when the questions come at you, sometimes rude, I understand, so that you are able to politely but firmly defend your ground.
Thank you.
So I think similar.
I mean, I just add something from the self-belief standpoint. So when I examine PhD students, I often find that one problem is that they just are really anxious about not knowing the material. But what I always say to them beforehand is, you know it better than us as examiners. You have lived through this for the past 3 or 4 years. So you should always think, I am the most expert in this area, in this room, at this point in time when I'm doing my exam.
Thank you.
That's incidentally a standard technique at the bar as well. You go into court and you think, I know these bundles better than anyone else in this room. So you already think, I've read them all. They haven't. They're judges, they're pretending they have.
Same with examiners.
Yeah.
These are fantastic questions. Thank you very much. Next one is from Sam Briggs. Sam, where are you? Over here?
Oh,
it's coming to you. It's coming.
Hello?
What's going to happen when someone drops this?
I know, big clatter. Could you clarify which one it was? I sent in 2.
Oh, did you? Are there ever moments where metacognition
yeah.
is decoupled from the task?
Brilliant, yeah, exactly. As a PhD student, I suffer from imposter syndrome, much like I'm sure many people agree with here. Do you have any sort of thoughts about metacognition and how they can lead you down that garden path and how you might be able to combat that and defeat imposter syndrome?
I'm sure we all know what imposter syndrome is. But for those of us who don't, what is it?
Well, I mean, I guess the imposter syndrome is thinking that you shouldn't belong there. And I think, I mean, in academia, everyone always talks about how they feel like they've got there by luck or chance, and all these other fantastic people in the department are doing much better than they are. But I think, yeah, absolutely. I mean, metacognition can come apart from your performance. I think that's what makes it partly interesting to study for us in the lab. We can try and isolate these mechanisms that govern metacognition. I think one rule of thumb in terms of avoiding these metacognitive illusions that I talked about is that when something feels, when you feel like you're performing something well, you just need to be mindful of, is that because I am actually performing it well, or is it because there's other cues? For instance, like we've seen in experiments, if you give someone a question in an easy-to-read font, then they will be more confident about their answers to that question than if the font is difficult to read. Now, obviously, that has nothing to do with their actual answer, but they feel more confident because the font is easier to read. So that's an example of a metacognitive illusion. And so we just always need to be mindful of, is my confidence real, or is it coming from some other source?
Does that answer your question?
That's great, thank you.
Okay, last question is from Will F. Where is Will F? There he is, in the corner.
Hi there. Declare an interest. I work for the university and with responsibility for getting more students, help them to be more active, play more sport and exercise a bit more. There's research out there, I'm not sure how much from UCL or Bristol, that talks about the impact of exercise on brain growth, brain development, particularly amongst children. But is there an argument for investing in physical activity to improve one's own metacognition?
I mean, I think there's not much that I know that's been done directly on the link between exercise and metacognition. But I guess the one thing we can say is the impact it might have via reducing stress. So this is something that I guess we talked about before. So to the extent to which exercise can help you get away from the library or the current project and reduce stress, then I would predict that that would have a beneficial impact on metacognition.
Michael, what would you like to say?
Well, I'm going to say I think it's like your stress. There's a curve.
Yeah.
If you go out for your nice, gentle 1.5 hour bike ride, you come back relaxed.
Yeah.
If, on the other hand, you did 7 hours in the Welsh mountains, you will find your cognitive performance dips to an all-time low, as I well know.
I think that is it. Do we have time for any more questions? Yes, should we have 2 more? Let's try and fit them in. Thank you very much. Right. Chelsea Bailey. Where's Chelsea Bailey? There she is, in the middle. Oh. I'm feeling quite stressed with all the drawing that's going on. Can you help me with my metacognition? Right, okay, Chelsea, what would you like to ask?
Well, I actually had 2 questions.
Oh, this one was, how can one deal with feeling that there's not enough time?
Yes, basically, I think this is relevant for a lot of students. You mentioned how it's important to keep personal interests alive. I totally agree with that. It's very important to have that sort of relief from studies or from work. But of course, I feel like I need to be a very responsible student and make sure I learn things properly. And I feel that if I don't spend more time doing things properly, I'm not going to get the same performance. How can you help with students who feel that they do want to do well, but they just would feel more confident having done thinking things over, doing and trying different study methods to then perform better?
Can you help with that?
Well, I think it's important to focus on what your end goal is, but also think that as you recognize in yourself, it is important to have that outside time, that you need that in order to pick up on what Steve was saying, sort of how you approach things. It's about working smarter. So I think it's about thinking about how you approach the task, be it revision or writing an essay or writing up notes or whatever it is, and thinking about how you're going to use that time as effectively as you can, which is something that you also picked up on, Georgie, with when you were trying to fit in your training and your law degree. So it's trying to get the most bang for your buck, I guess, out of the time that you've got. And I think that's really what metacognition will help as a technique to think about, actually, how do I do that? We get many calls from students who feel very overwhelmed by the work, particularly in law. There's a lot of pressure for law undergraduates to feel they want to come out with a top-class degree because that's their gateway into the profession. But also it's thinking about you as a rounded person as well, which is right what Dan said right at the beginning. It's about your abilities to think. It's not just about how well you can do at exams. And it's those things that you do outside or your approach that help you develop those skills that will help you when you get out into the world of work, because that's a whole new ball game when it comes to pressure and stresses and how you balance that.
Chelsea, is there anyone else on the panel that you would like to ask the question to?
Well, actually that ties in a lot with my second question. My second question was, what about those people who have been, for example, I can speak for myself, at least I was very good in my class at school, I did very well, but I always felt that I wasn't prepared enough for things. And now, as I'm starting university, I can't compare what I did at school to now, so I'm even worse in a sense that I probably would do okay, but I'm not sure if I'm prepared. And I'll probably do well, but I just don't have that metacognition to know where I'm at.
It sounds very... What year are you in? Can I just ask?
First year veterinary degree.
Basically, you're saying what I said, and I'm sure quite a few people on this panel said in their first year as well. So I'm no expert. I want to tell you, first of all, do not feel overwhelmed, because we were all probably A students at school. You come here, and you're nowhere near an A student, but please do not panic, because it gets better. But anyone who knows a bit more about this, Michael, can you help with this?
Well, the fact you're saying it shows at one level you're very conscientious. And I can draw some analogy here with the bar, because often very bad barristers don't worry about their cases. They don't worry about them because they're just going to go swan into court. If it goes well, they'll go, that was down to me. And if it goes badly, they'll say, well, the witnesses didn't really come up to proof or something. The good ones do worry. Of course they do. They worry. They think, is that worth? And so the fact you are doing that is obviously good. But my only tip would be you've got to have a structure by which you don't tip into the point where you're trying to work all night and it becomes counterproductive, which is what we've all been talking about here. No. So you have to have a timetable. You have to say, I'll stop work at 6 o'clock at night. That's it. I've done it. I've prepared. There's no more to do. You're not going to get any better. If you stay up till 4 in the morning, you're just going to go into the test or whatever in a nervous frenzy.
Elizabeth, just to finish on this point?
I was just going to say, it's a common trait in lawyers and law students is a very perfectionist-driven personality. The mindset that everything you do has to be perfect. And it's trying to learn sometimes just being good enough or doing something good enough is okay at that particular time. And also picking up on something that was said in the panel, there's a big tendency with lawyers to ruminate and run over in their minds all the time. The things I haven't done, the things I haven't done well, I didn't do good enough in this test. And actually trying to flip that thinking and think about the good things, the positive things that you're doing, and try and take that self-reflection and think about the positive, good things that work for you, how you can analyze that situation and think about how you can change that. Because it is a challenge, particularly for young people, those sorts of traits. If you need to learn how to manage those and develop some techniques to cope with them, because as you go through your career, those things are going to become, the challenges you face may be more overwhelming. And so learning how to face those and manage them and recognize that you can get on, you will do well, is really important.
Okay. Georgie, you want to say something quickly on this?
Sorry, just quickly.
No, it's fine.
I was just going to say that I think it's very, very easy to compare yourself to every single other person. And actually, something that we worked on with our psychologist was Again, as athletes, it's very easy to be super critical and really focus on your weaknesses. And actually, we did a session on what are our strengths and what is our super strength. And every single person in the squad had to sit down and tell them 5 things that they were good at, and then what was their super strength that they were going to be the best in the world at. And drawing analogy into sort of the working world and the studying, I just think it's very easy to get really, really bogged down in what am I bad at, what could I be better at. And actually sometimes it's stepping back and thinking, oh, I did quite well today, you know, I got a good mark on that. And actually it's very easy to get caught up in comparing yourself to everyone, but actually focus on yourself and what you're good at.
Yeah, and this is classic November. Are we still in November? Yes, we are. It's classic November thinking. It really is. You wait until March. It'll all be different. Okay, final question from Harry Davis again to end on. Where are you, Harry? We've got a question for Georgie to end on.
Better check that one again. Bear with me. Be worth it, hopefully.
He's just finding it on his phone.
Yeah. New to Twitter as well, which doesn't help.
Oh, don't worry. Bless you.
Georgie Twig, same penalty preparation as English men's football. Do girls simply have more bottle than blokes?
I like that. I actually saw something in the newspaper recently about how the men were going to be training for the penalties. I think there's just something about being prepared, and I think it goes back to what you said about actually having a structure and a process in place means that you can control everything that you can control. And yes, there are going to be external factors, but yes, maybe the men's football team can learn a little bit from
He's being very diplomatic. Well, listen, that's it. Thank you for your questions. Thank you for taking part in this event, and thank you to this fantastic panel, to Stephen Fleming, Georgie Twig, Elsa Hammond, Michael Ford, Elizabeth Rimmer, and thank you to you as well for coming. Good night.
Thank you.